All right, welcome everyone to Understanding the Basics of Pesticide Drift. My name is Audrey Thompson and I'm a staff attorney here with the Penn State Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. The Understanding Agricultural Law educational series is a course designed to provide subject matter literacy and competence on fundamental issues of agricultural law to attorneys and business advisors who work with or represent agricultural or rural clients, but who may not necessarily specialize in agricultural law. This series is wholly sponsored by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's Ag Business Development Center, established through the 2019 Pennsylvania Farm Bill. The Agricultural Business Development Center aims to enhance the long-term vitality of Pennsylvania farms by supporting farm transitions, both from generation to generation and from conventional to organic, supporting beginning farmers, providing risk management education, and providing financial assistance through low-interest loans and grants. As you can see here on the slide, we have covered numerous topics so far, including ag cooperatives, finance, the farm credit system, ag labor, conservation programs, Pennsylvania's Clean and Green program, and many, many more. You can find materials and recordings for all of these webinars on our Understanding Agricultural Law landing page on our website at aglaw.psu.edu. We encourage you, next slide please. We encourage you to go ahead and mark your calendars and register for more of our upcoming programs. We've got in the Understanding Agricultural Law Education Series, we've got the Clean Water Act and Ag, Impaired Waters and Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL processes. That's going to be on March 24th. Oh, it says 28th there. Okay. And then we've got PA Ag exemptions for inheritance tax and real estate transfers on April 25th. That is the correct date. Those dates are both on Fridays at noon Eastern Time, and Attorney CLE is available for those programs. We also have another program under our quarterly dairy legal webinar series on April 15th. That's going to be bovine disease controls, federal and Pennsylvania laws and regulations. And then you can pencil in July for the quarterly dairy legal webinar. We're looking at doing the final federal milk marketing order final rule that was just published in January, but we'll have more information on that in the coming months. Next slide, please. And then we've also partnered with Pennsylvania Small Business Development Center, Agriculture Center of Excellence, to offer a program on March 5th. That's going to be compliance with the new federal and state business entity information filing requirements. That program will feature Center Staff Attorney Brooke Doerr and Emma Rose Stroll of Barley Snyder. The program is hosted through the Small Business Development Center, but you can access registration from our events page there in the chat. I will let you know, while the information presented in that program is going to be undoubtedly outstanding, Attorney CLE is unfortunately available for that program. Next slide. And finally, just a few reminders before I turn this webinar over. Oh, here's what I really got to put. It's the Attorney CLE. This webinar is being recorded. And if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A feature, and I will collect them and ask them at the end. We also encourage you to fill out the poll or the survey at the end in the webinar. Tell us what you liked, where we can improve, what topics you'd like to see in the future. And if you would like for us to submit this program for free CLE to the PACLE board, or send you an attendance certificate that you can submit to your state's CLE board, we've got a link in the chat here. I'm going to post it again and again. You need to fill out this form for this link to get your CLE. Posting it again. I know people are joining as we speak. And part of our responsibility to ensure attendance for that CLE, as part of that, we're going to provide you a code word later in the program. You must enter that code word into the form to get your credit. If you are calling in or you cannot access this, you can email me, AET17, that's Alpha Echo Tango 17, at psu.edu, and I will send you the link to the form. My email is also all over our website, and I'll post this again. All right, I will now turn this webinar over. Jackie Schweichler is a staff attorney at Penn State Law's Center for Agricultural and Shale Law, where she researches numerous ag law issues, manages student research assistants, writes the Shale Law Weekly Review, and coordinates the Pennsylvania Agricultural Mediation Program. Jackie, the screen is all yours for Understanding the Basics of Pesticide Drift.
Awesome. Thank you, Audrey. I appreciate it. So as Audrey mentioned, my name is Jackie Schweichler, and I am a staff attorney here at the Ag Law Center. The title of today's presentation is The Basics of Pesticide Drift, but I focus the content towards organic agriculture and a little bit on sensitive crops. So to get there, we're going to be covering a little bit of everything. I've been thinking about this as like a buffet of different topics. So I'm going to start things off by talking about pesticides, and then I'm going to move over to a quick review of organic regulations. And then I'll start focusing on pesticide drift and pesticide drift liability, again, with that focus towards organic ag and sensitive crops. Please note that I have included many slides in this presentation, but we're going to be going through them pretty quickly. My plan is to highlight the things that help explain the interplay of pesticide drift and liability for organic farming, but I didn't want to leave out important information or resources. So there's going to be slides that I kind of touch and then skip, but they're included so that you can reference them later. My hope is that I've included enough information on these slides in the way that they can be used as a guide for anyone who's interested in looking through this. Okay, so pesticides. Going back to basics, the term pesticide is a lot broader than I think most people, layperson, might realize. It includes compounds or mixtures. The purpose of a pesticide, of course, is to destroy pests. But the term pests, that can include a lot of things. It can include insects, rodents, mushrooms, fungus, weeds, but it can also include animals, plants, viruses, bacteria, and other microorganisms. The definition of a pest does not include bacteria or microorganisms that are inside of a human or animals. And they're not meant to treat human disease, of course. This slide shows the Environmental Protection Agency's list of types of pesticides. There's a ton. I'm going to highlight a few of those on the list that I think are particularly relevant to this conversation. To start, here are some of the more recognizable types of pesticides. You have insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Just so you know, the root side is from Latin and means like the act of killing or killer. So insecticide very literally translates to insect killer, and fungicide translates to fungus killer. So when it comes to pesticide drift, two things I want to mention is that you'll hear a lot in these conversations about dicamba and 2,4-D. So I think it's helpful to mention that they are considered herbicides, just for the sake of this list. In addition to these more recognizable products, I also just want to highlight a few more that I think are helpful in this context. You have defoliants, they cause plants to lose their leaves. You have desiccants, they cause plant material to die and dry faster than normal. You have plant growth regulators, they alter the growth rate or reproductive rate of plants. And then fumigants, which produce gas or vapor intended to destroy plants, destroy pests, like in buildings or in soil. Plant growth regulators are interesting because they can be synthetic compounds or natural hormones extracted from plant tissue. They're generally marketed as fertilizers or biological stimulants. And when I think fertilizer, I don't really think pesticide, but plant growth regulators are regulated as pesticides. So again, when we're thinking about the term pesticide, we have to think really broadly. And as for fumigants, I included them here because, like herbicides, fumigants are frequently cited as a source of pesticide drift. So there are three main laws that we have to be familiar with when we're talking about pesticides. The first one on this slide, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, is the one that I will reference the most. And I'm probably just going to call it FIFRA for most of the time. We might also see the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act from time to time. This act imposes safety standards for food additives and pesticides. With this act, there has to be a reasonable certainty of no harm. And this is for pesticide use on food crops. And lastly, we have the Food Quality Protection Act. This act imposed stricter tolerance levels and cumulative assessments, especially and kind of emphasized children's health and being protective there. So a little about FIFRA. This was originally written to protect consumers from fraudulent or misleading claims. It requires that all pesticides that are sold, distributed, or used in the United States to be registered with the EPA. The big change in the 1972 amendment was that anyone registering a pesticide must prove to the EPA that the pesticide will perform its intended function without unreasonable risks to people and the environment. Unreasonable adverse effects include economic, social, environmental costs. And of course, this includes any dietary risks. If you want to know more about pesticide registration, I have a couple links on the slide that will lead you to more info. So each applicant for registration of a new pesticide has to provide a complete copy of the proposed labeling for the pesticide that includes all claims made for it and the directions for its use. And of course, the application has to state how the pesticide is classified. So who's in charge of enforcements? It's mostly up to the states. States are the primarily responsible for monitoring compliance of pesticide applicators with FIFRA and with state laws. So we already kind of know this. The label is the law. Any deviation from the label requirements is a violation of FIFRA and state law. Label requirements are often very detailed and dictate the conditions under which the pesticide may be applied. And a lot of these labels do have techniques and ways to avoid drift. So if you are using a pesticide in a manner inconsistent with the label, you're breaking a federal law. Okay, so pesticide applicator certification. This is another key element of basic state pesticide programs. States have tremendous freedom in setting up their applicator certification programs. The usual distinction in state programs is between applicators who apply pesticides in agricultural and forestry uses and those who apply pesticides in buildings. All right, so anyone who handles a restricted use pesticide from the manufacturer to the end user, everyone, they all have to keep and retain records. The records have to include information about where and when the pesticide was applied and the weather conditions that existed at the time of the application. This is going to be significant later when we're looking at liability and causation. So going back to a couple of the other statutes, the Food Quality Protection Act requires the Environmental Protection Agency to set these pesticide tolerances. This applied to all new pesticides going forward and required EPA to reassess pesticide tolerances that were already in place at the time this rule was passed. So this assessment was huge. It included like over 9,000 pesticide tolerances that had to be reviewed within like a 10-year period. About 4,000 of these tolerances were revoked or modified as a result of this review. So how does the EPA set tolerances? First, the EPA has to make a safety finding. They have to determine if the pesticide can be used with a reasonable certainty of no harm. They'll also consider child sensitivities, and they'll consider aggregate risks for multiple sources. They'll make note of, the impacts on food, water, homes, things like that. All right, that was our very quick, fast overview of pesticides. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about organics for a little bit. The graph on this slide is from USDA, and it's an excellent summary of organic farming. If you're completely unfamiliar with organics, this is your one slide definition. It's, so with produce and grains, we're talking about using natural fertilizers, eco-friendly pest control. It's meant to protect soil and water. To anyone who attended the understanding of the basics of organic agriculture, much of the content here should be familiar to you. If you need a refresh on the topic, or if you didn't attend that webinar, you can check out the recording on our YouTube channel. Okay, so on the next few slides, I have some fun facts that I found on the National Ag Statistics Service website. The data is based on a 2021 farm survey that was released in December 2022. This is the most recent survey that I could find on their website. I don't think they've posted anything new since then, and if they have, send me the link. Okay, so first, it's important to note that the organic industry is the fastest growing segment of agriculture in the United States, or it was at least at this time. In 2021, the sales of food and non-food organic products reached $57.5 billion. In the US, there are over 17,000 certified organic farms. So I'm a visual learner, and I love a color fade map. And with this map, you can really see where the concentrations of organic farms are located. The dark red states have 1,000 or more farms, where the light yellow states have fewer than 50 organic farms. And so you can kind of see where we are in Pennsylvania and New York. There's a lot of like red and orange in that area. And then you go more west and you've got some yellows over there. except for California, of course, which is a lot of sales. And so for those of you who prefer a list, don't worry, that is on the next slide here. So these are just the top 10 states by certified organic sales. Again, the data is based on the 2021 National Ag Statistics Survey, so these numbers might be a little bit different. California's at the number 1 spot, followed by Washington and then Pennsylvania. And you've also got Texas, Oregon, New York, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Michigan, and Colorado in this list. So since this webinar is being brought to you by Penn State and we're in Pennsylvania, I'm also going to include just a couple Pennsylvania-specific fun facts. So Pennsylvania is listed as number 1 in organic livestock and poultry, with sales reaching $730 million. Pennsylvania is also number 1 in organic mushroom sales at $95.4 million. The ranking for mushrooms is probably less surprising since Pennsylvania is like a powerhouse with mushroom production and things like that. And then the last point on this slide is the total number of certified organic farms for Pennsylvania, which is 1,125. There are only 3 states with more than 1,000 certified organic farms. Pennsylvania ranks at number 3, behind Wisconsin and New York. Please also note that the total number of acres of organic farmland in Pennsylvania is 104,805. So it's over 100,000 acres of organic farmland. Meanwhile, like the rest of the state, it has in total 7.3 million acres of farmland. So we have a lot of acreage, that 100,000 acreage, that's at risk from drift. And then we have even more acreage that's at risk for, liability. I left this slide and just emphasize Pennsylvania's commitment to organic with its relatively new PA Preferred Organic brand. The most recognizable part of the Organic Foods Production Act is the National Organic Program. We're going to spend most of our time while we're talking about organics on this particular section. So the NOP began in 2000. It's administered by the Ag Marketing Service, and I will link to the website on this page in case you're interested in learning more. So the National Organic Program certifies products that are organically produced. So when you pick something up at the grocery store and the label says that it's USDA organic, it has been certified under the National Organic Program. Before the program started in 2000, organic products weren't certified they were certified by private organizations. Those private organizations made their own rules with voluntary standards, or they were based on state law. From state to state, it was really hard to know what counted as organic. Now, under this program, state officials or private persons can be accredited as organic certifying agents. Each state can have its own certification for producers and handlers. The caveat here is that the certification standards must be more strict than the standards in the National Organic Program. If a state wants to amend their program, they need to submit that amendment to USDA in order to get it approved. So what do you do if you want to get your operation certified as organic? First, you need to submit an organic production or handling plan to an accredited certifying agent. The agent will then complete an on-site inspection and check your records. There are fees involved, so be mindful of additional expenses if you're thinking about transitioning to organic farming. So when you or a business operation submit your organic production and handling plan, the plan has to meet a few requirements. It has to be in writing, describe all the practices, have monitoring practices, describe the producer or handler record system. There's a whole host of things. This is just a quick snapshot of that. And then if you need to find out whether or not a business is certified as organic, you want to go to the USDA Ag Marketing Service website, and you can look at their organic integrity database. And this slide is hyperlinked too. You can't see the link, I think, on the slide, but it's hyperlinked. So if you have the slides from our website, you can click there. This gets its very own slide because it's important and a common misconception. People often think, a lot of consumers think that when they purchase something that's certified USDA organic, they're getting a product that's never been touched by a pesticide, which is not necessarily true. So under the National Organic Program, there are a few different labels that you might see. For most consumers, this is the most practical application of organic labeling. This is what you're going to see at the store, the 100% organic, or made with organic ingredients. So if it says 100% organic, that means that everything in the product has to be organically produced. So if there's any testing that reveals a prohibited substance, they can't be labeled as 100% organic. And then if it's labeled organic, it has to have at least 95% organic ingredients. And then, of course, if it's made with organic ingredients, then it has to have that 70% organic ingredients. This is just a nice graph published by the USDA that just says what I just said on that last slide, but it's helpful if you want to like save this picture somewhere. Moving on. Okay, so next on our list of provisions with the Organic Foods Production Act is the national list of approved and prohibited substances. You can see on this, we kind of skipped some of these provisions. We don't have to talk about all of them. Again, I'm just trying to do a quick overview of organics before we get into the pesticide drift section. So this is a link to the national list where it shows allowed substances and prohibited substances for organics. And this is also on the Ag Marketing Service website. When it comes to synthetic substances, USDA is responsible for providing some exemptions. Some synthetics are allowed if they're not harmful to human health or the environment, if it's really necessary for production, there's no natural substitute available, and the use of the substance is consistent with organic farming. There's an and in that section, not an or, so it has to meet all of these factors in order for USDA to allow the substance to be used as an exemption. Organic farmers are supposed to use light, sound, or traps in order to get rid of pests. That sounds, to me at least, like that it would be extremely difficult to make that work. So part of the reason that I'm doing this overview of organic agriculture is to highlight the difficulties that organic farmers undertake. So when drift damage does occur in an organic farm, it's not just the value of crops that they lose out on. They had to follow all these additional requirements and put in a lot of extra work to make their crops successful. That said, going back to the list, there are some substances that an organic farmer can use if those methods do not work. They can be found on the national list. So let's see. So I don't think we need to go into this. Another exception to the National Organic Program is that a farmer might be able to use non-organic methods in the event of natural disasters or drought. So if there's an emergency, there's some exceptions, and you might be able to keep your certification. So if products that are approved for organic use are often labeled with this little cluster of leaves, it might include the text for organic production. So if you are an organic producer and you see this symbol, it's probably means that you're good to go. You can use that. Since most of us aren't going to actually go to the national list, for those of us who are just here for academic purposes, I threw in this graphic because I love this visual perspective. There are over 900 synthetic active pesticide products that can be used in conventional farming, and those are represented by those blue dots on this graphic. Meanwhile, there's only 25 synthetic products that are allowed in organic crop production. And that's that green line at the top left there. And those 25 products are restricted and can only be used if mechanical, biological, and natural methods have been tried first. So they are very limited in what they're allowed to use. The last provision that we're going to talk about with the Organic Foods Production Act is the procedures for investigation and enforcement. So organic standards, they're enforced by the Ag Marketing Service and organic certifiers. The organic certifiers, they're going to enforce organic regulations by inspections. They're going to collect some samples. They might investigate if there is a violation or an alleged violation. And if there is a problem, they'll enter into settlement agreements to correct those violations. And, if all else fails, they might suspend the certification. So USDA publishes a compliance summary quarterly and annually. And you can see here that at the end of 2023, which is the most recent update that I was able to find on their website, there were 327 cases in progress. I really like to look at what types of violations because I think it's very interesting. On the left, we have the cases in progress. We have some labeling errors. The orange section is fraud. The yellow slice that's at, I believe, 6% there is pesticide residues. So there's the cases in projects that in progress. So that's really interesting to see. Okay. let's get into the actual pesticide drift of things. So talked about pesticides, talked about organics. Now it's what is drift? So drift is defined as an airborne movement of pesticides from an area of application to any unintended site. This is the definition by the National Pesticide Information Center, not necessarily the EPA definition, which is a little more confusing and nuanced, but I like this definition better. Pesticide drift can be caused by high winds, fog, or application of pesticides during a temperature inversion. Drift can also occur when the applicator applies the pesticide incorrectly. For example, if the applicator uses a spray nozzle that isn't designed to work with the type of formulation that they're using, or maybe they're spraying a little too high above the field. So what can drift do? It can cause physical damage to neighboring fields and plants. It can cause damage in the form of causing an organic farmer, to lose their certification. It could also, cause harm to people or animals and can pollute waterways. Like I said, drift can impact humans, the environment, agriculture. It can have especially a strong impact on things like grapes and vineyards and other sensitive crops. Oh, I just circled organic crops, so that's our focus. Okay, so testing the impact of pesticides on the human body is really complicated. Obviously, humans aren't supposed to consume pesticides, but the ingestion of pesticides is inevitable in the world that we live in. I'm not going to talk about environmental impacts a lot. Our focus is more on agriculture specifically, and sensitive agriculture. So there's a million other resources out there on environmental impacts. I have got a list of them. If you want it, just let me know. And that would be a much longer presentation, I think. So for runoff and drift, the National Organic Program actually requires organic farmers to use a buffer zone that generally starts at 50 feet. So some certifying agents might require the buffer zone to be even greater, depending on the risk. Buffer zones are meant to protect the organic farm from airborne drift and runoff. There are different options for buffer zones. Organic farmers can use plants or trees or grasses. They can use specialized fencing. Cover crops and no-till practices could also help. Maybe the farmer can convince their conventional neighbor farmer to plant cover crops too. You can work with your neighbors. There's all kinds of options to prevent or reduce drift before it happens. So according to USDA, the presence of pesticides in organic crop doesn't necessarily take away organic certification. I said that a couple times, but I'm gonna keep saying it. If the presence of pesticides in the organic crop was inadvertent and the organic producer if they followed the NOP regulations to prevent the contamination, they might still keep their certification. So if there's some presence, but they did what they were supposed to do, there might be some wiggle room there. But that said, if the organic farmer loses their certification due to the actions of a conventional neighbor farmer, the organic farmer might sue in a negligence or other type of tort action. Depending on the state, they might bring a strict liability or trespass claim. So let's talk about liability. Let's talk about that. So pesticide applicators can be sued when spray chemicals are found on someone else's property. There are a variety of reasons as to why this might have occurred. The classic example is overspray, where the chemical was actually sprayed directly on a non-target area. Another possibility is that the chemical was sprayed on the target crop, but the chemical was volatilized or the wind carried it to a non-target area. The chemical may have also reached the non-target area by runoff or the action of water, right? Water's involvement. So for pesticide drift, there are two main legal issues: legal liability for the applicators and products liability. We're only going to touch on products liability briefly today and instead focus on applicator liability. Products liability is the legal issue, we're probably most familiar with it with the Roundup cases that started with Roundup and Monsanto, but now is with Bayer because Bayer purchased Monsanto. These are those $1 million cases that are being decided now that the courts were determined that glyphosate caused lymphoma, cancer. And so products liability, what we're saying there is that the product, the thing itself, caused an injury. Meanwhile, applicator legal liability is focused on the actions of the applicator. As my usual PSA here, I'm just going to pause and just say I'm going to talk about different options that you may have as a pesticide applicator or as a landowner, but this is not legal advice. If you're in the situation, talk to your insurance advisor or your attorney before making any business-related decisions. Oh, and if you are very interested in products liability relating to pesticides, a great place to start would be the glyphosate Roundup topic. And we at the Ag Law Center, we have an issue tracker for glyphosate where our research specialist, Chloe Marie, has been tracking cases in legislative actions for some time now. It's a great resource. Okay, so first let's talk about strict liability. You are strictly liable for an injury if you are involved in something that's considered inherently dangerous or if the activity could be considered ultra hazardous. If strict liability applies, the injured party does not need to prove that you were negligent or that you intended the injury to occur. A person can be liable regardless of how careful they were during the activity. For example, if a person is setting off explosives in their front yard and an injury occurs, they might be held liable under the theory of strict liability due to the ultra-hazardous nature of the activity. It doesn't matter if that person was very careful with their explosives and tried really hard to it's an explosive. So our purposes, the question is whether pesticide application qualifies as an ultra-hazardous activity. So as of 2020, 27 states have addressed the issue as to whether aerial application of pesticides is considered an ultra-hazardous activity. 8 states have in some way determined that it is an ultra-hazardous activity and therefore a strict liability crime. Meanwhile, 19 states have determined that aerial pesticide application is not ultra-hazardous. Please note that we're talking about aerial pesticide application and not ground application. So in Pennsylvania, we don't have any laws that specifically define whether damages from pesticides are strict liability crimes. So, but we do have one court case. So, but I have 3 on the slide for a reason, because the first one referenced the other 2. So in the first one, we have Valari v. Terminix. The family had hired this company to spray a pesticide because they had termites in their house. And then there were some issues. So the family sued under strict liability relating to the applicator's liability and for products liability. The court in this case found that the application of a pesticide within the home was not an ultra-hazardous activity, but they found that the pesticide was hazardous when it was inhaled and that the homeowners were not properly warned of that danger. In this case, it was something about the labeling on the container was insufficient. And so, I'm so sorry, I lost my spot. So a product can be found to be defective if it fails to come with warnings of foreseeable risks. So in this case, the application of the pesticide was non-hazardous, but the plaintiffs were able to argue that the product itself was hazardous, and so it still fell under the strict liability theory for, again, products liability. So how could this apply to pesticide drift going forward? Someone could bring a lawsuit and argue that the applied pesticide was ultra-hazardous, which means that it would be a strict liability crime, and you wouldn't need to prove that the applicator did anything wrong. And like I said a second ago, the Valari case refers to the other 2 cases listed here. In Lowe v. Lenhart, the court found that crop dusting is an ultra-hazardous activity and strict liability can apply. And then in Bennett v. Larson, the court found that pesticide spraying is not an ultra-hazardous activity. But note that neither of these 2 cases are Pennsylvania cases like Valari. So in other words, a Pennsylvania court might look to these 2 cases for inspiration, but it's not necessarily indicative of how a Pennsylvania court may actually rule on these issues. So what is the rule in Pennsylvania? Does pesticide application fall under strict liability or not? Again, in the Valari case, the court said no, at least for applying pesticides. But they noted that under Section 520 of the Restatement of Torts, one of the factors in reviewing the ultra-hazardous nature of an activity is, quote, the extent to which its value to the community is outweighed by its dangerous attributes. So for value, the court talks about economic benefits. In the Valari case, the plaintiffs were the ones who received the value from the pesticide application. They invited the company to spray for termites in their home. In other words, part of the reason the court did not allow the plaintiffs to bring a strict liability claim for their application was because they had invited this interaction or in order to receive a benefit. This is very different from a non-target pesticide application case. So if contact with the pesticide is not invited, so like an overspray situation, and the damaged person did not receive any value or economic benefit, then perhaps those factors could support a charge of strict liability. So if these last two slides seem like a lot of back and forth, just my bottom line is at this point, we do not know whether non-target damage from pesticides would fall under strict liability, at least in Pennsylvania. The next legal theory that you might hear in a pesticide injury case would be trespass. Trespass is the intentional physical interference with a person or property, or intentionally causing something to enter the plaintiff's land. If someone walks onto your land and takes a stroll through your grapevines without your permission, that's trespassing. If I'm your neighbor and I stand on my property and I throw rocks at your house, the rocks entering your property and breaking things over there, that's trespassing. So a landowner who experiences pesticide injury could file a suit under the theory that a neighbor who sprays pesticides that enter their property has committed a trespass. All it takes is for them to argue that the pesticide droplets entered the property and that liquid caused damage. There's no limit to distance when it comes to trespass. So if you're a pesticide applicator and you've never personally walked onto someone else's property, you could still be liable for trespass. And if you're applying someone else's land and it crosses and it causes damage. So nuisance. When it comes to nuisance, that's an activity that's designated as harmful or annoying. By definition, nuisance is interference with a person's private use and enjoyment of their land. If you've ever lived near a college campus, like me, you're familiar with noise complaints. That's nuisance. The noise is interrupting your private use and enjoyment of your apartment or your home or whatever. So if unwanted pesticides have damaged your property, then that interference would disrupt the use and enjoyment of your property. And when we say that the use of the property has been disrupted, that translates to the loss of any crops that may have died or been injured by the pesticide. And then you could therefore theoretically bring a nuisance claim. Last but not least, we have negligence. The other theories that we talked about are important to paint the picture of an issue, but they're not going to be the types of claims that the plaintiff's attorney adds to the suit, or they are going to be the kind that they add as like an extra, as sort of a second thought. Those claims, nuisance and trespass, less likely to make it all the way to a trial. Meanwhile, negligence, that's the one that you're probably going to be working towards. So all our lawyers out there remember their first year of law school. What is negligence? It is the failure to act as a reasonable person would act under similar circumstances. They ask the question, was the person careless or thoughtless? Did they not do something that they should have done? Under this theory of liability, there are 4 factors that a plaintiff would need to prove. First, was there a duty? In pesticide application, generally, yes. The law imposes a duty on the applicator to follow the rules so that a pesticide doesn't spread to non-target areas. Second, and most significantly, is the question of whether there was a breach of duty. This complicates things a little in that we have to answer another question: what is the standard of care? The standard of care is going to be what a reasonable person would do in similar circumstances. So did the applicator fail to act in a reasonable manner to prevent damage from the pesticide? So if you're not applying the pesticide according to the label, you're failing to meet the standard of care. And now, but the problem is that if you follow the label, but you don't apply your pesticide in the way that everyone else says is the safest way, then you might also not meet the standard of care. So you want to do things like checking the temperature, check the wind speed. Did you clean the tank and set the proper spray rate? All those little extra things that might not be official requirements, but are actions that most people take to prevent overspraying. At the end of the day, the jury makes the decision on whether or not your actions were reasonable and whether or not you breached your duty of care. The last 2 factors are a little easier to explain. Proximate causation is about whether the injury is a reasonably foreseeable result of the defendant's misconduct. Keywords here, reasonably foreseeable. So if you apply pesticides in an improper manner, it's reasonably foreseeable that it could damage someone else's property. And lastly, actual damages. Did the pesticide actually damage the neighbor's property? So if it kills off, some your organic grapes or harms your whatever it is, then sure, you've got actual damages. But let's say the pesticide only hits like an old tree that you don't even like very much, or some weeds that you're not, in a field that you're not even using. I mean, is that really still damages? How much are those weeds worth to the landowner? What are we talking about here? Okay, so if an organic operation is damaged by pesticide drift and they decide to bring a lawsuit, the most difficult part of the process is almost certainly going to be proving who or what caused the damage. The first thing that the organic operation should do is to call their state pesticide agency and request testing. If the damage appears to be extensive, they might want to also consider having testing completed by an independent laboratory. If they want to pursue a lawsuit, the private laboratory is going to be able to give them maybe additional information, additional testing that they can use in their lawsuit. And all of this testing needs to be done as soon as possible. I've heard, that it's really short. It needs to be done within a week. I've heard some people say that it needs to be done within 48 hours, but as soon as possible, you'll have to have your testing done. The last bullet point on this side is for satellite imaging. So there's like 9,000, thousands of satellites that are orbiting the Earth, taking pictures every second. It's not impossible that there are photos of the pesticide application on the field suspected of drift. I don't know the extent to which this has been used, but I imagine that it could be very helpful if there's ever a disagreement about when a pesticide was applied. Going back to that records keeping. So if we say that an applicator says that, oh, I applied the pesticide on X day and there were only wind speeds of 4 miles per hour, right? But then the neighboring organic farmer says, no, you actually applied it on Tuesday when we had 35-mile-per-hour winds. Maybe theoretically, they could get a satellite image of the farm showing when, they actually applied the pesticide. I've heard a few people talking about this. I've not actually seen anything conclusive as to how this has been used or how this can be used, but I'm very interested in this topic. So I've got a couple resources, a couple links on this about pesticide exposure, but I would love to learn more about this. So if you have information on this, please send it my way, because I think it's crazy using satellites for something like this, but I'd love to learn more. Okay, so going back to the state agency testing. If the state agency tests the organic property and they determine that the applicator violated FIFRA or state law, the organic operator could bring a negligence per se lawsuit. In that case, the state agency they've taken care of the first two elements of negligence, and then the organic operator only needs to prove causation and damages. So if you are a pesticide applicator, or if you're advising a pesticide applicator, what's the best way to avoid potential lawsuits? Step one, very simple: comply with all the laws and regulations. It seems a little too obvious, but if you are found to have violated any laws, the claim is going to be negligence per se, and it's going to be a lot easier for them to win that lawsuit against you. The label is going to have instructions on how to apply the pesticide in a way that helps you avoid damage to non-target areas. And if you don't comply with those instructions and damages occur, you've got some negligence per se on your hands. The second point, follow best practices, whatever those might be. You want to stay up to date on what works best, talk to your neighbors, sign up for a newsletter, attend presentations, more technical presentations than this one. And, the idea is, even if the law doesn't require you to do something, if there's a procedure that's considered to be an industry standard, you put yourself at risk if you ignore that procedure. So as you've probably noticed, most of these slides say applicator legal liability at the top. In most cases, a landowner is not going to be liable for the actions of an independent contractor who causes pesticide drift. But that said, there are some exceptions. One exception would be if the state considers aerial pesticide application to be inherently dangerous. In that case, the landowner would be co-liable with the independent contractor. So as of 2020, only 20 states addressed directly whether aerial application of pesticides is an inherently dangerous activity. Of these 20 states, 16 states say that yes, aerial pesticide application is an inherently dangerous activity. 4 states say that aerial pesticide application is not an inherently dangerous activity. And so those landowners would not be held co-liable with their contractor. If you are interested in this topic, Tiffany Dowell-Lashman and our friends at the National Ag Law Center have put together a comprehensive document that compares landowner liability for non-target pesticide application. Compares all 50 states, focusing on whether the state has determined if aerial pesticide application is an inherently dangerous activity and if strict liability applies. This is going to be helpful to anyone operating out of state and is, getting like, that's a lot of Pennsylvania stuff. Well, here's some resources for non-Pennsylvania. Okay, so preventative measures. What can you do to protect yourself from liability? This for both sides. So, always still risk. Insurance is one of the best ways to protect yourself. A couple notes on this. First, check your current insurance. See what it would cost to add coverage for drift. If you don't know off the top of your head, there's a good chance that your farm policy excludes pesticide drift from the policy under pollution exclusion, or it'll be phrased something like that. Insurance for pesticide applicators often includes drift, but it doesn't always include drift. When you start looking into this, note that insurance companies might use the term chemical drift too, so keep an eye out for that. They might use pesticide drift or non-target application, but I would look for chemical drift. And then, speaking of specific insurance terms, if your insurance coverage has a pollution exclusion, you should consider purchasing an endorsement. So an endorsement acts as a rider to your insurance policy, and maybe get a specific endorsement that covers chemical drift. And it doesn't hurt to ask for a quote. Talk to your insurance company. So for commercial applicators, general liability insurance pays the injured person for losses, but not the insured applicator. So if you are a commercial applicator, your insurance company will pay legal obligations, but note that they will only pay for harms caused unintentionally. That sounds kind of obvious, but just something that you should be aware of. So, and again, even as commercial applicators, make sure that you are watching out for pollution exclusions that apply to pesticide drift claims. Continuing on with exclusions, there's a list of damages that could be excluded from your policy. First, your own farm and produce might not be protected. So if you apply pesticides on one field and it damages another field that you own, you're unlikely to be insured for that. Second, if the damage occurs with intention, your insurance company wouldn't pay for that damage either. I just kind of mentioned something like what we just said with the commercial liability insurance. The question here is what it means to intend. So if you deliberately apply a pesticide on a windy day, or if you know that there's a high risk of a temperature inversion, that could be a factor. And then insurance policies don't always cover injuries to people. So if someone is able to prove that your application of pesticides hurt them in some way, you might pay for their injuries yourself. Lastly, were the government to require testing or some version of environmental remediation, you might have to pay for that as well. Insurance coverage is going to be different for aerial application. In other words, if you use aerial application methods, double check that it's covered under your policy. And if you get a claim, report it to your insurance carrier as soon as you can. Your insurance carrier is going to have a team who can document the evidence. And if you don't tell them right away, you might lose your coverage. The longer you wait, the less evidence your insurance company can collect. And if you delay unreasonably, your insurer might push back and may try to get out of paying anything at all. And if I went through this insurance section too fast, or if you're just looking to read more, the Grapevine, it's an older article, but it's still a very good one. It's liability coverage for chemical drift, and it has a lot of stuff on insurance in there, so I definitely recommend checking that out. As I mentioned before, this is kind of a conclusion of this section. The best way to protect yourself is to follow the letter of the law. Check the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's website, stay up to date. On the PDA website, you'll find all kinds of resources on pesticide product registration. And then you can check FIFRA. Pennsylvania, the minimum risk pesticides have to be registered according to Pennsylvania's Pesticide Control Act. So go on the website, look around, check it every few months, see if there's an update. Moving on to preventative measures and best practices for applicators. So if you're an applicator, go online and look for resources for pesticide drift reduction strategies. There are so many resources available. I've included a handful here, but there are many more out there. There's also a few on the resources document that's on our website. You know, there are resources that are so much more technical and scientific than I could possibly inform you of. So I'm going to go over a little bit, but there are much better resources on this topic than this presentation today. So this is really just for the lawyers out there who, you know, you'll recognize some of this stuff, but we don't have to know this. And again, I cannot tell you what the best practices would be, but I've done my best to identify and kind of narrow down some of the really common recommendations that I've seen. And most of these are actually from the Montana University PDF that was listed on the previous page. So the first one is to read the label. Obviously, you know, the label is going to tell you some of the better ways to avoid drift. You're going to want to select a high or a low volatility pesticide. So I've heard a lot of complaints, especially in the grape industry, about esters. So if you're picking a 2,4-D ester, maybe consider a lower volatility pesticide, like 2,4-D amine, if that's an option for you. And then another good choice is to select a product that can be used with a larger droplet size. So that's important. Larger droplets don't travel as far. I've got a slide on that too. And then you're going to want to make sure that you are applying during appropriate weather conditions, check for temperature inversions. You're going to want to use drift reducing nozzles. There's actual nozzles that are like meant to reduce drift, which is really cool. There are chemicals that you can add to your solution, drift retardants, that will make the solution less likely to travel. And then, of course, you should always check field watch or field check. I really like this chart because it shows how droplet size can have such an enormous impact on drift. So using a spray nozzle with an extra coarse droplet size causes the liquid to fall in 1 second causes it to fall 10 feet in 1 second and potentially 4.7 feet in distance. Meanwhile, a very fine spray could cause the droplet to take 4 minutes to fall 10 feet and travel thousands of feet from the target site. And then fog is on an entirely different level. Fog droplets can take over an hour to fall and can travel 3 miles. That's crazy. It's very cool. I love seeing stuff like this. It's very fun science, but wow, what a difference. And then I also wanted to throw this slide in here because I think it's a really good picture showing a temperature inversion. So temperature inversions aren't always visible. And if you're like me and you do not understand the science of temperature inversions, fortunately, there are tools that you can buy that will do that testing for you. I think there's something that you just stick in the ground. It'll just tell you what you need to do. Field Watch. Field Watch is this really cool thing. It is a free online website with a map for your location, showing other locations that are sensitive to pesticides. This website is an absolute must for both the pesticide applicators and for organic growers. If you are a pesticide applicator, you should be checking this site before you spray, maybe every time. It's a great way to double check to make sure that you're taking every precaution when it comes to spraying near organic or other sensitive crops. If you are an organic producer, this is an excellent way to let everyone know where you're located, and they'll know that they need to be careful when spraying near your field. This is a screenshot of the website. This is the Field Watch view. You can really zoom in and out of this. You can zoom into your own location and get a better idea of where the sensitive areas are located. It's a pretty easy site to navigate. I was able to figure it out quickly, so you know it's not complicated. It only takes a few minutes to double check. So next steps for organic growers. So what do you do after drift occurs? On this slide, I've made a basic checklist for organic growers. If you haven't been damaged by non-target pesticide application, look at the left side of the slide. You should first probably spend some time, review your insurance coverage, and see if you have chemical drift coverage. If you have neighbors who spray pesticides, talk to them. Have a friendly conversation. It's your neighbor, like, hey, by the way, we have these sensitive crops. Make sure that they know what's going on and are sensitive and aware of what you need. You should also consider posting some warning signs that say, pesticides can't be applied here, etc. And then maybe take some pictures of areas that you consider high risk, or if you know that your neighbor sprays and you've got an area that's really close to there and maybe you don't have the best relationship, take some before pictures, just kind of routinely take pictures of your farm. If you've already experienced some damage, take pictures of the damage right away. Take multiple pictures in different lighting, and then, of course, get the plants tested. You want to get notify the if you're in Pennsylvania anyways, you want to notify the Pennsylvania Department of Ag and get testing done as soon as possible. And then it might also be wise to go through a third-party independent laboratory too. And then if you are an organic farm, you should notify your organic certifier. And again, you might not lose your certification. There's a few different factors that they'll look at before making their decision. My impression is that most certifiers are willing to work with the organic grower to salvage what they can. You should also contact an attorney. Even if you want to avoid a lawsuit, it can't hurt to have someone lined up. Calculate the cost of the damages, figure out how much the damaged crops are worth, and make an estimate of your losses. Obviously, if you lose your certification, even temporarily, that could change your cost calculation significantly. Last, consider resolving the issue out of court. Rather than paying thousands of dollars for a lawsuit, you could try to get compensation from the pesticide applicator through the Agricultural Mediation Program. And for those of you in Pennsylvania, here is the PA Department of Ag Bureau of Plant Industry, links to their site. I have a few phone numbers here that I got from the National Pesticide Information Center, but if they don't work or you're watching this recording down the road, I suggest just Googling the number, you'll find it. I'm not necessarily recommending anyone on this list, but I wanted to share this resource since I imagined it might be really difficult to find a private testing laboratory if you've never gone through this before. And at Practical Farmers of Iowa, they made this great list of private testing labs across the US. So the link to that is on this slide. So, you know, if you have a concern about this or you just want to know where to get started finding an independent lab, this is a great resource for that. Speaking of great resources, we've got this one from the Purdue Extension, and it's called Options for Dealing with a Pesticide Drift Incident. The link to that is on the slide. Another great article is this Field Guide to Vineyard Herbicide Drift. This guide focuses on grapes, which is a little different, but it's still helpful from a sensitive crops perspective. And I helped write it, so this is just a shameless plug. Okay, so dispute resolution. Got a couple more slides here, but we are almost done. Restitution. So if you find out that you've experienced financial losses from drift, you have a few options. You can file a lawsuit. You can kind of come to a informal agreement. You can do mediation. Please note, this is important here. There's nothing on this slide about receiving money from your state's pesticide regulator. If your state's pesticide agency confirms that drift occurred through testing, they might issue a financial penalty to the applicator. But the money from that fine doesn't go to you. The money from that fine goes to the state. So the person who actually experiences the financial loss doesn't receive anything. In other words, in Pennsylvania, you are not going to receive compensation from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. You have to seek compensation on your own. The most direct path is going to be hire an attorney, file a lawsuit. It's going to take a long time, and as we discussed, causation can be difficult to prove, but the lawsuit really is the most obvious answer. The other option is to try to come to an agreement with the applicator. If they're willing to work with you and they've offered to pay some of the damage, you might be able to figure something out sort of informally and sort of have a, memorandum of understanding, an agreement. They pay for this or that, and we kind of work things out on your own. And as for mediation, so if you don't want to get you can't afford an attorney and you don't get along with the pesticide applicator, another option is mediation. So USDA has an agricultural mediation program, and it's in most states. We actually mentioned this at the top too. It's in the recording video that we do, and it's on our website. Pennsylvania has an ag mediation program, and one of the covered topics is pesticides. So if you get into one of these situations and you want to resolve it out of court, and you don't want to deal with an attorney or in a lawsuit, you can shoot us a message. We'll get you set up. It's a third-party neutral mediator who does this. Right now, the program is free as of right now, for now, and we'll try to help you out and work things out. And you can contact me directly. I'll put my email in the chat if it's not already in there somewhere, or you can send us an email at agmediation@pennstatelaw.psu.edu. I think that's all we have for today. So Jackie, thank you so much. That was truly wonderful. What a great jog through of pesticide drift and organic, and that was really great. So for everyone still on,
Please join us next month for Clean Water Act and Ag, Impaired Waters and TMDL process. And with that, we will say goodbye.